Thank you everyone so much for being here with us today and taking time out of your busy day. I am Marlia Negron. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Research at the network Advocating Against Domestic Violence. And I am here with my colleague Shelby, and I'll pass it over to her to introduce herself.
Hey everyone, it's really exciting to have so many folks here. My name is Shelby Hoffman Binder. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as data and research associate on our larger policy advocacy and research team here at the network. I'm really excited to jump into all the details today. And I think Marley is going to kick us off with a little bit more information about what to expect.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shelby. So for today's agenda, we're going to be giving a brief introduction of the report. We're going to be going over sources as well as definitions. We're also going to be covering background on this intersection of domestic violence and gun violence nationally and what the trends are that we see via studies. We're also then going to be diving into the domestic gun violence report itself and our key findings. And then we're going to be giving some background on the United States Supreme Court decision, United States v. Rahimi, as well as federal regulations and prohibitions on this intersection and what state law and regulation is in play and on the books in Illinois. And then we're going to be covering finally the network's key legislation, which is Karina's bill. And we're going to be talking about how all of our findings, all of the background research really supports this initiative and what our goal is with Karina's bill. A brief note, we just want to make sure that you are taking care of yourself throughout this presentation. We will be discussing really heavy topics, including gun violence, homicide, and suicide. We want to make sure that you do whatever is necessary to take care of yourself, your mental health. And if you need to step away from the presentation at any point in time, please do so. We encourage that. There will also be a recording of this presentation provided in follow-up materials. So if you miss a part of the presentation that you'd like to see later, or you'd like to see the slides later, that will be provided in follow-up emails. We also want to take a moment to thank the survivors who took time out of their days to speak to us about their lived experience that is also reflected in this report. We want to really emphasize that every data point that we talk about here is an actual life and community impacted by domestic gun violence. And that cannot be overstated enough. And we really want to thank those survivors who relive some of the most horrific parts of their lived experience to share for this report to make sure that it's not just data and numbers, but it actually has real lived experiences behind it. So for their safety, they remain anonymous, but we really thank them and appreciate them for taking the time to talk to us. So with that, I will pass it to Shelby to take us through our introduction.
Yeah, thanks so much for kind of laying that groundwork, Marlia. As we jump into today's presentation, we want to take some time at the beginning to really make sure we're all on the same page about a lot of the language we're going to be using today and about some of the sources that underlie our research. So we're going to touch on very briefly who we are here at the network, what measuring safety is as a project, and specifically what you need to know about the Gun Violence Archive, which is the primary source in this report. So, who are we? What is the network? The network is an organization that really leads a coalition of gender based violence agencies to end domestic violence. We are really fortunate to be able to do that work in a number of different avenues. First and foremost, we reach and support survivors of domestic violence directly through our work as operators of the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline. That's a statewide resource for survivors all over Illinois that they can access 24/7 and know that they're connecting with highly trained, trauma informed staff who are ready and prepared to meet them exactly where they are and provide them with the information, resources, or tools that they need. We also serve our Chicagoland member organizations who work in this field through trainings and resources. We have well over 40 member organizations, all of whom do work on domestic violence, sexual violence, human trafficking. And we are so grateful to have that network because it allows us to really pool knowledge and resources to speak with one voice as we advocate for policy and systems change that supports and improves the lives of survivors across Illinois. Let's talk a little bit about measuring safety. Measuring safety is an annual data report that is produced by the network, and we approach this project every year with the goal of assessing experiences of gender-based violence across the state and how our systems respond to those experiences. For those of you who have been familiar with the network for a while, you might know that in years past, this was one large report that we published in the middle to end of each year. This year, we have decided to break it out into smaller volumes that we hope make it a little bit more accessible to our readers, allowing us to really target key topics like domestic gun violence, for example, and ensure that it gets into the hands of the people who can most use that information. Um, in particular, the project, like broadly, aims to provide information about gaps in our services and systems and steps that are needed to repair harm and prevent further violence. This report specifically is zeroing in on that broad goal through the lens of domestic gun violence. And we're going to talk about what that means in just a moment. While we put lots of hard work into these reports, doing a great deal of like background research and making sure all the numbers that we present to you are accurate and contextualized, we want to emphasize that measuring safety is not a scientific study. So that means that we're not drawing causal conclusions when we look at these numbers. We're really looking to provide context about what we know is happening so that all of the different stakeholders in our community can come together and think about solutions. And we, of course, propose some solutions in today's report as well. Now let's talk about the primary source behind this report of measuring safety, which is the Gun Violence Archive. The Gun Violence Archive is something that our previous readers might recognize from Measuring Safety 2022. That's the first time we used this resource in any of our published work. But this is our first report where it is really center stage and getting a deep dive. So I want to just take some time and make sure we all understand what the Gun Violence Archive is and what it isn't. Throughout the presentation, you're going to hear us abbreviate Gun Violence Archive to GVA pretty frequently. The Gun Violence Archive is an independent, nonprofit online archive of gun violence incidents that are collected from a myriad of sources, well over 7,000 different law enforcement agencies, media sources, government and commercial agencies that provide information to the Gun Violence Archive that then coalesces that information into an almost real-time database that lets us take a look at gun violence in Illinois, excuse me, in the entire United States. We can then filter it down to Illinois, which is what we did in today's report. It's a really fantastic tool. And one of the real strengths of the Gun Violence Archive as a resource is that it is a dynamic database. Because they have access to so much real-time information, that means that they report information as they have it. So for example, if on Monday there was a shooting and somebody was injured, they're going to record that incident as having one victim injury. But if, for example, a week later, that person passed away from their injuries, the Gun Violence Archive goes in and they change their record. They update it to reflect a victim death as opposed to a victim injury. I tell you all of this to emphasize that when you look at the Gun Violence Archive, matters for the totals you'll see. So the data that's in this report was drawn out of the Gun Violence Archive between June 27th and July 1st. And later this year, if you happen to take a look at the Gun Violence Archive yourself, you might see some slight discrepancies in the totals. And that's just because as time goes on, more information about a case emerges, and there may be changes to certain kinds of statuses that are updated and reflected in that database. So know that this is a snapshot, and those numbers might change over time. There are some key terms we want to define for all of you that come from the Gun Violence Archive, and then a little bit of added context we want to add as the network. But first and foremost, let's look at these definitions. The Gun Violence Archive describes gun violence and captures incidents of gun violence as any kind of shooting of a firearm, regardless of who shot or why. This means that acts of self-defense or incidents where an officer uses lethal force in a shooting, those are all documented equally as gun violence incidents. They get the appropriate code so that we can distinguish those incidents out. But I just want to emphasize that, the Gun Violence Archive is documenting any shooting, regardless of why it happened or who was ultimately the shooter. Murder suicide is a term you're going to hear quite a bit about today. A murder suicide is an incident where one person kills one or multiple individuals and then kills themselves in the course of a single incident. So, over a pretty tight period of time, typically at the same location, but not always. This report does include totals for attempted and completed murder suicides. And the reason we made that decision is that we think the intention of killing oneself and killing others is the sort of important thing for us to document, regardless of whether or not all people who were targeted in that incident actually went on to pass away. We're also going to talk about mass shootings in today's presentation, and I really want to emphasize what the definition we are operating with is. The Gun Violence Archive defines a mass shooting as 4 or more people who are shot or killed in a single incident, excluding the shooter, regardless of the location. There are lots of different sources out there that track gun violence in different capacities, and in particular, that track mass shootings. And what I want to emphasize is that most sources have a different definition of mass shooting. You'll see them vary based on the number of people who were shot. Some places include the shooter, other places do not. You'll also see it's sort of change. So for some agencies, it's 3 people, for some it's 4, for some it's 5. And the location often matters as well. There are certain sources that choose to exclude private settings, which is where we know the majority of domestic gun violence related mass shootings occur. So I just want to emphasize that the numbers you see here are uniquely mass shootings identified in the Gun Violence Archive. And if you look at other sources, we shouldn't be cross-comparing those statistics because they're probably operating with different definitions. Lastly, I want to talk about what we mean when we say family annihilation. You may also hear the term familicide, and that's going to be functionally the same thing. The Gun Violence Archive just happens to use the term family annihilation in their incident characteristics list. When we talk about a family annihilation, what we mean is it is a type of murder or murder suicide where an individual kills multiple close family members in quick succession. This is typically children, spouses, siblings, parents, sometimes aunts and uncles, and sometimes the shooter themselves. What I want you to understand about our use of terms like family annihilation and murder suicide in today's presentation is that they are not mutually exclusive. So sometimes an incident of family annihilation is also a murder suicide if the shooter injures or kills themselves in that process. But sometimes they're separate, right? Sometimes a murder suicide just involves 2 people and is not also a family annihilation. Sometimes a family annihilation does not involve injury or death of the shooter. So know that those can sometimes overlap. It's a bit of a Venn diagram, not always. Lastly, I want to emphasize that the Gun Violence Archive has a number of limitations to it, which means that they do not collect or report demographic data like race. We're going to talk about the reality that gun violence, particularly domestic gun violence, does disproportionately impact people of color in this country in a little bit. But know that none of our statistics from the Gun Violence Archive have that kind of granular detail because that information is not collected uniformly by the source. One more set of definitions that I want to emphasize here, and this is some context that we at the network want to offer in addition to the definitions that you can find with the Gun Violence Archive. First and foremost, when we talk about domestic gun violence today in our report that you all have access to on our website, we are specifically talking about an incident of gun violence that is documented in the Gun Violence Archive that contains the characteristic domestic violence. That's going to be any kind of case that comes into their system with some kind of flag about domestic violence. Importantly, incidents that don't escalate to a shooting are not going to be captured in this database. And we know that potentially thousands of survivors across the state are living with the threat of gun violence. They are not reflected in these totals. We are looking very concretely at what is available to us through the Gun Violence Archive. We also use terms like survivor and person causing harm. And I just want to quickly define those for you as well. A survivor in this context is going to be a person who's experienced gender-based violence in some capacity. And a person causing harm, who you might also sometimes hear characterized as an abuser, is somebody who is using power and control to enact gender-based violence on someone else. I want to make one final point, and then I promise we can get into the actual content of today's presentation, but that is this. In the Gun Violence Archive, there are terms like a victim death, a victim injury, and terms like suspect death and suspect injury. In this context, victim death or injury refers to the person who was injured in the incident of gun violence, and suspect injury or death reflects the person who perpetrated the gun violence. Importantly, not every victim of gun violence is the victim of domestic violence in this scenario. There are a number of ways this might play out. We're going to talk about later the likelihood that other members of the community might be injured in a domestic violence related incident. So somebody's new dating partner, their loved ones, like their children or other family members, might be subjected to gun violence. In which case the victim of domestic violence is not the victim of the shooting or the perpetrator, right? So we just want to emphasize that we are using total deaths and total injuries in our report. We're not breaking it out by victim status because we think that talking about the result of this violence is important regardless of who that person is in the scenario, be they the victim of domestic violence or not. Okay, I know that was a lot of information. I'm going to hand it over to Maralia to start talking a little bit about the background you need to kind of come into our Illinois data with opened eyes.
Thank you so much, Shelby. We know that that was a lot, but we feel that the context of our definitions and our sources is really important for you to be able to review the data in a meaningful way. And so we're going to talk about what we know about this crucial intersection of domestic violence and gun violence and how firearms can be prevalent in the lives of survivors and how that ultimately impacts not just those survivors and ultimately victims, but also the larger community and the lasting impacts that domestic gun violence can have. So first, we'll talk about firearms in the lives of survivors. Survivors are more likely to live in a home with guns than members of the general public. So we know that in some cases, survivors may not have ever had a firearm pulled on them, may never have been shot at, but the mere existence and threat of the firearm in the home does exist, and it can be used as a power and control tactic to control survivors. And I think that that feeds really nicely into the second stat that we commonly refer to, which is survivors who experience gun violence are more likely to experience PTSD than other survivors. So when that firearm is present, when it is part of that domestic violence dynamic, we know that post-traumatic stress disorder does result as part of that lived experience. We also know that survivors of color are substantially more likely to be impacted by gun violence than any other type of demographic. Again, to Shelby's earlier point, unfortunately, our sources don't include that information, but we know that studies nationally really do paint this picture, and there are a lot of anecdotal points and cases that we can refer to on this matter. And for example, Black women face 5 times greater risk of domestic gun violence homicide during pregnancy and postpartum than white women. And so we want to emphasize again just the impact of having a firearm as part of the domestic violence lived experience, and also pointing to if you're interested in reading any of these reports and these studies, please refer to our full report where we have the full list of citations. So, what this means to the individual who is at risk of homicide as it relates to domestic gun violence. We know that access to a gun increases the risk of intimate partner homicide 500% in a domestic violence home. So, in other words, just the mere presence of the firearm, again, being part of that domestic violence situation, really moves the needle in terms of the risk of homicide. We also know that 63% of women killed with a gun are shot by an intimate male partner, and 2/3 of intimate partner homicides are committed using a firearm. So we know that in terms of means of how homicides are happening, firearms undoubtedly are the most common tool and weapon used against survivors. Something else that we really like to point to really drive this home is the intersection of orders of protection, firearms, and survivorship. And we'll be covering this in more depth when we talk about Karina's bill and the need to address this. But a study of domestic violence homicides found that among victims who had an order of protection, 1 in 5 were killed within 2 days of the order of protection being issued, and about 1/3 were killed within a month. And so we know that the highest time of lethality for survivors is when they make that decision to leave. And the firearm is used as the last real tactic to maintain control and maintain that individual in that relationship and in that really violent situation. We also like to emphasize how, the combination of domestic gun violence can really impact whole communities. And we think that this is something that doesn't get enough attention when we talk about firearms, when we talk about community violence. Really, the violence in the home can trickle outwards. And that includes domestic gun violence. Domestic gun violence homicides are much more likely to result in multiple victim deaths than non-domestic gun violence homicides. So what that means is, and we'll talk about this when we talk about our Illinois data, is it's more common for multiple victim deaths to happen when it starts as domestic violence. So again, it starts in the home, it starts with the killing of the partner or the wife or the husband or the parents or the children, and then it trickles out to the community. And that's how you have this ripple effect of what starts as domestic violence in the home impacting the larger community. And I think that this next statistic, where domestic violence accounted for anywhere between 65 to 74% of all murder suicides in the US in the last 20 years, really drives this first stat home, which is, folks are committing this in their home and then going on to kill themselves ultimately at the end. Domestic violence mass shootings were responsible for 72% of all children and teen deaths in mass shootings over the last decade. And I think that is obviously horrific, but it really drives home the impact of how something again that can start in the home can impact the most vulnerable in our community. So now we're going to pivot to how, now that we've laid the groundwork of this horrific intersection, right, of firearms and domestic violence, of what domestic gun violence looks like in Illinois and what we uncovered with the data. So now I'm going to pass it back to Shelby.
Thanks for giving us that groundwork, Marley. I think it's super helpful to keep those numbers in mind, that sort of like national context as we think about Illinois, because I think we found overwhelmingly results that really align with a lot of the like scientific studies that happened at the national level over the last few years. Okay, so, as we embarked on this journey of really digging into the numbers in Illinois, it was really important to the network to take a pause, to step back, and to contextualize what we were seeing in Illinois with other states in the nation. And what we found was really alarming. In fact, Illinois is the ninth highest state for domestic gun violence injuries and deaths across the country last year. Something that really strikes me as I look at this list of the other folks having really high rates of lethality and injury is that many, though not all of these states, are states where we do not see a great deal of firearm regulation. Whereas here in Illinois, I think we have historically prided ourselves on having common sense gun laws in place. And what that tells me, looking at the company we are in on this list, is that there is something unique to domestic gun violence that makes us a leader on this list, and that demands a unique tool or intervention to reduce the impact that domestic gun violence is having. So that's something that we're going to keep in mind as we talk through that this is an incident rate nationally that is quite alarmingly high. Okay, last year, those totals that we were just looking at, we found that there were 109 domestic gun violence shootings across the state of Illinois. And you'll see here a county level heat map that shows you where those incidents occurred. You'll see where it is darkest is largely our densest population centers in the state. So of course we've got Chicago and sort of the larger suburban area, right? Some of our collar counties contain a lot of our highest density communities. We also see some darker shading down in the St. Louis area. But what strikes me about this map is really that there were incidents of domestic gun violence across the state, and that it is not unique to any one particular kind of community in Illinois. It is not an urban, suburban, or rural problem. It is something that occurs in homes across Illinois. You'll be able to see additional details about each incident in each county in our report if you'd like to take a detailed look. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the primary trend that we found in domestic gun violence in Illinois over the last few years, which was really a startling growth in fatal domestic gun violence since the pandemic. And I want to take a moment to just kind of orient us to this chart because I know my head gets a little boggled when I look at one for the first time. So you'll see here our beige or like tan line is the number of incidents or the number of shootings that happen every year. You'll see that pre-pandemic, our totals were really like meaningfully coming down year over year. We saw them starting in the 130 range and dropping all the way down in the immediate post-COVID period to just over 100, right? And that's a really promising sort of trend. And really post-COVID in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen that number of shootings itself kind of stagnate. So we're staying at that number just over 100, which is a really a startling figure, but it's not really moving. We're seeing that sort of year over year, over 100 incidents occur in the state. Our teal line is total deaths that occur as a result of these shootings. And this is the trend that we saw really changing in an alarming way. So you'll see that pre-pandemic, as our shootings were coming down, so were our deaths. And post-pandemic, in the last several years, we've started to see an increase in deaths related to these incidents. And in the last couple of years, that has become a really sharp increase. In fact, since from 2022 to 2023, we saw about a 27% increase in those deaths. But if we zoom out and we look pre-pandemic at 2019, we've actually had a 63% increase in deaths related to domestic gun violence as of 2023. This pink line I want to clarify as well is our total injuries related to domestic gun violence. And you'll see a similar sort of trend where it was kind of coming down a little bit pre-pandemic, and then it has also hopped up post-pandemic and started to be on a bit of an upward spike. Fortunately, in the last couple of years, we've started to see those injuries come down, which is a really promising trend, but they are overall hovering at a much higher average than they were pre-pandemic. These dotted lines at the end reflect our current trajectory path for 2024. So we did these calculations based on data from January through May. So we divided those out, averaged the first 5 months of the year, and then projected if we continued at that rate for the next, 12 months to see the full year. And what we found here was really striking. Illinois is on trend to have 130 domestic gun violence deaths in 2024, which would mean that without intervention, we're on path to double, more than double the number of deaths in the last 5 years. I think we here at the network consider that to be a crisis that demands our attention and demands an appropriate intervention. We also want to emphasize that this issue is really unique to domestic gun violence. It is not a trend that we see reflected in gun violence broadly across Illinois. So this chart, we're looking at injuries and deaths again, but these are all non-domestic gun violence incidents in the state. So everything else that happens that is not related to domestic violence. And what you'll see here is that our pink line for injuries soars above deaths, because typically gun violence does not result in such lethal outcomes, but domestic gun violence uniquely does. In fact, when we took a look at last year, we found that on average in Illinois in 2023, each domestic violence shooting resulted in more than 3 times as many deaths as any one non-domestic violence shooting, which tells us at the network that we need a tool to address this problem that is uniquely targeted at domestic gun violence. Of course, this prompted lots of questions for us as we looked at this growing trend in deaths about whose deaths, what accounts for this change. And I think that we found something interesting, which was both that victim deaths and suspect deaths meaningfully increased in the last several years. So you'll see here, we've got 2 figures that are circled on this chart. This is a breakout of deaths and injuries. So they're stacked up on top of each other. This sort of light green color is victim deaths, and that lighter pink, purpley color on top is the suspect deaths. And you'll see that in 2023, there were 71 victim deaths, which compared to 2022 is a 32% increase, and compared to our pre-pandemic era in 2019 was a 65% increase. So the number of victims dying in these incidents is growing. But I think even more starkly, we also found that the number of suspects who are dying is growing. In 2023, there were 34 suspect deaths, which compared to 2022 was a 55% increase. But compared to pre-pandemic was a 143% increase. So we're seeing a really stark jump there as well in suspect deaths during these events. We really wanted to understand what could be accounting for this. And we found a few different things. We found growth in murder-suicides related to domestic violence, mass shootings related to domestic violence, and family annihilation incidents. And we're going to walk through that one by one here. This chart is looking specifically at all murder suicides that occur in Illinois over time. Our teal color is domestic violence related murder suicides, and our tan color is any other kind of murder suicide that's not related to domestic violence. And there's kind of two things I want to draw your attention to here. First is that we see, kind of like with shootings broadly, pre-pandemic, these incidents were coming down, and in the last few years, they've begun to balloon. But in addition to ballooning, I want us to look at the proportion of these bars that are teal, that are domestic violence. Because last year, 82% of all murder suicides in the state were domestic violence related firearm murder suicides. So not only is the number of murder suicides growing, but the proportion of which are related to domestic violence is also growing. This tells us that domestic violence is the primary driver of murder suicide in the state of Illinois when it comes to firearm facilitated murder suicides. Last year, we saw 18 completed or attempted murder suicides related to domestic violence in the state. That is double the number that were in 2019, pre-pandemic. So here again, we've seen a full doubling in the number of incidents like this. Similarly, we've seen a growth in multi-victim domestic gun violence incidents, which include both family annihilation incidents and mass shooting incidents. What we've got here is a little timeline for you. So going from 2017 all the way up through May of this year. And you'll see that for many of these years, really like I think 6 years in a row, there were no major incidents of family annihilation documented in the state of Illinois. And in that same period of time, we only saw one mass shooting related to domestic gun violence concretely, and that was in 2018. But starting in 2022, we see this start to change. In 22, there were 2 mass shootings related to domestic gun violence. And last year, in 2023, we saw 6 mass shooting incidents and 5 family annihilation incidents in the state where huge numbers of people were dying at once. This year, we have seen 3 of each as of May of this year, which means that we're on track to have as many as 7 family annihilation incidents in the state, the loss of 7 entire families of Illinois citizens, and potentially 7 mass shooting incidents as well. So this is a really concerning, very recent trend that really caught our attention as we tried to understand what was driving the growth in fatalities.
Thanks so much, Shelby. So in the next part of the presentation, as Shelby mentioned, we're going to be covering the recent Supreme Court decision in United States v. Rahimi. We're also going to be talking about firearm regulation as it relates to domestic violence, both federally, some of the Supreme Court decisions that lay the groundwork for Rahimi, and what that means in Illinois. So a little bit about the history of gun regulation and domestic violence. So we'll start in 1996 with the Lautenberg Amendment. And this was an amendment that came from Senator Lautenberg of New Jersey that amended the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968. And essentially what came out of this amendment was the prohibition of gun ownership for 2 specific reasons. One was the conviction of a domestic violence misdemeanor, or being subject to an order of protection. And this was huge for the domestic violence community, for survivors writ large, and is often referred to as the domestic violence offender ban. And so we're going to put a pin in that amendment to the Federal Gun Control Act of 1968 as we move to the next, the timeline to the right here, and talk about some really monumental Supreme Court decisions that lay the groundwork for where we are today on regulation around guns and domestic violence. So in 2008, Dick Heller, who was a law enforcement officer in Washington, D.C., brought about a case which was essentially challenging regulations that had passed in Washington, D.C., um, requiring that weapons in the home be stored, unloaded, and disassembled or have trigger locks. The regulation also tried to make sure that folks didn't have as much access to handguns as in prior years, and there was also a grandfather clause requiring the registry of those handguns. And so essentially, what Mr. Heller did was he said that this regulation in Washington, D.C. was an overstep to his Second Amendment rights. And he challenged it, and the Supreme Court sided with him in a ruling of 5-4. And what came about in that decision was really this two-pronged test to which lower courts started to evaluate gun regulations. And the two-pronged test was one, a historical analysis. And what that meant was, in looking at the question of firearm regulation, does it meet the historical context for which the Second Amendment was passed and written? And so things that the courts looked at were things such as a history of mental health, being convicted of a felony, and having access to firearms in public places, such as in schools or in government buildings. And the second prong was the means and scrutiny test. And this essentially is the courts weighing the government interest to public safety against the regulation of firearm rights. So it was this two-pronged test where, if the first part, the historical analysis wasn't met, then does the government have a high enough threshold to be concerned about this access to firearms and the means and scrutiny test? And so this was what came out of that decision, kind of opening up the ways in which the court started to look at gun regulation. And so the Lautenberg Amendment that we discussed earlier passed that test, and we were okay with the way that the Lautenberg Amendment was used moving forward. There was no question about the two prohibitions on gun ownership in the Federal Gun Control Act. Well, in 2022, the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association v. Bruin case came about. And essentially what this was a challenge to New York state law, what the state law did was it required that individuals who had access to firearms show a proper cause for having that concealed carry license. So their ability to carry out in public, to have access to firearms. And in Illinois, we do have a concealed carry law, but really in New York, it was a bit stricter. And it was asking, what is the reason for which you should be exempt from the general public to have rights to firearms in public settings? And so the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, along with two individuals who had been denied their concealed carry permits, challenged the state law, which brought about this Supreme Court case. And what came about out of this case was essentially a change to the ways in which we started to evaluate gun regulation. And instead of having the two-prong, historical analysis and means and scrutiny test, the means and scrutiny test was removed, meaning that the government could no longer say, we have a vested interest in regulating this question of firearms in public. We're only going to look at it in a historical context. So in the time of the Second Amendment, would this law be on the books? And if it wouldn't, then we're going to strike down this law. And so that is what happened in this case. And so it really was a opening up and a broadening of Second Amendment rights in the United States. And this is what kind of laid the groundwork for domestic violence gun regulations to come into question. And so as a result, we have the 2024 Supreme Court case, United States v. Rahimi, which came out of Texas and was a decision that came out of the Fifth Circuit. And the Fifth Circuit includes the states of Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And it was an interpretation of this standard that came out of Bruin. And what the Fifth Circuit said was, in looking at the question of historical analysis, the Lautenberg Amendment, or this provision within, the Federal Gun Control Act, does not meet the historical standard of regulating firearms. And so having an order of protection against you is not enough to bring your Second Amendment rights into question. And so that was the challenge. And the Fifth Circuit decision really impacted and shocked the domestic violence community and advocates and survivors who were ultimately directly impacted. And so what came about this July was an astounding decision from the Supreme Court that we were on pins and needles about. And they essentially affirmed that domestic violence gun regulation does meet that historical analysis. And so in the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what the case did and what came about it. So how this case even came about, we talked a little bit about the history of gun regulation and the Supreme Court cases that laid the groundwork for him to be able to even challenge the law. But really, Zaki Rahimi of Arlington, Texas, was convicted of possessing a gun while he was subject to a domestic violence order of protection, which was issued after he assaulted his partner in a parking lot and shot a gun after others had witnessed his abuse. And so this was a really public display of violation of the order of protection and his prohibition of having a firearm under federal statute. And so in 2022, as I mentioned, he challenged the federal law, which pretty much saying, the domestic violence order of protection shouldn't be enough to bring my Second Amendment rights into question. And so it made its way up. And this July, the Supreme Court took the case up and overturned the lower court's decision, pretty much saying again that the historical analysis standard was met for domestic gun regulation. And so it was really a huge win for our community. And we are very relieved, is an understatement, for the decision and for the courts applying a very straightforward decision and interpretation of the federal law, which essentially says the federal standard stays, and what states want to do beyond that is up to their discretion. There is most certainly historical analysis and interpretation that firearm regulation, as it relates to domestic violence, is absolutely there. And so why Rahimi matters, I think it's pretty straightforward as to why it matters for domestic violence survivors and us as advocates, is it allows us to continue to try and regulate this really dangerous intersection that we covered extensively in the earlier part of the presentation, and how this is such a lethal combination. But really what we want to emphasize is that, when it comes to common sense gun regulation and domestic violence, this was a huge decision. So the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, commonly referred to as NICS, is really used, and it's used here in Illinois as a screening tool for folks who either have an order of protection against them or have been convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. And so it's an automatic screening tool for those who are applying for their firearm license. And what we saw in doing this research for the report is more than 250,000 domestic violence abusers have been prevented from legally purchasing a firearm with the creation and this common sense background check that is backed up by our federal statute. So again, the federal prohibitor is being put into play and being acted upon in this background check system. And so if Rahimi would have come down a different way, this all could have come crashing down, and the most basic of coverages and safeguards for survivors could have come into question.
Thanks for kind of walking us through exactly why protecting these federal prohibitions matters so much, Maralia. I kind of wanted to take a moment and talk us through what those federal prohibitions look like in action here in Illinois. So we know that there are two reasons why somebody might not be allowed to have a firearm related to domestic violence federally, right? It's that conviction of a misdemeanor or the presence of an order of protection. And the way that we instituted that here in Illinois is through our FOID Act, the Firearm Owner Identification Act. A FOID card is what says here in Illinois you are a licensed gun holder. And it basically outlines everything that is in that federal prohibition and adds one sort of added layer. So it says here in Illinois, you cannot have a FOID card and therefore cannot legally possess firearms if you are convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor. If you have violated an order of protection within the last 5 years, that's unique to us, and or if you are currently subject to an order of protection. If for any reason you are found to no longer be an eligible FOID holder, if your rights to a FOID are suspended, it is then your responsibility to return your FOID card to the Illinois State Police and to account for your firearms by completing a self-attesting disposition record. So you're supposed to sit down and fill out a form that says where you are going to give your firearms now that you cannot legally possess them. Then you mail that with your FOID card to the Illinois State Police. It's an entirely functionally like honor system. And it is something that we will see is a little complicated by the fact that it is functionally an honor system. Something that we feel very strongly here at the network is that prohibition without enforcement is not enough to keep survivors safe. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that really looks like in Illinois right now. In Illinois right now, there are many cases where somebody's legal status as a gun owner is suspended, right? So their FOID card is automatically marked as, invalid, but their actual FOID card and their firearms are never removed or accounted for. In 2022, across Illinois, we saw that about 45% of all ineligible FOID card holders had never accounted for their firearms. So they never filled out that form and told us who was going to get their firearms now that they could not legally possess them. That's almost half of all of the people who are not supposed to have firearms, whose guns are functionally in the wind, right? We don't know where they are. Or if they continue to be in the possession of somebody who is not supposed to have them. We also saw this locally. In 2022 across Chicago, the Chicago Police Department saw a 7% decrease in the number of domestic violence related FOID card recoveries. So, where they actually go and take somebody's physical card. But we saw that FOID suspensions increased by 20%. Right. So we're seeing a rise in the finding that somebody is not supposed to have firearms legally, that they are not meeting this criteria, and a fall in accountability for taking those tools away, that legal, that card or their firearms themselves. And this sort of, what is the word I want? This incongruity, right, between what the law says and how we enforce the law is really what brings us to our primary recommendation for the day, which is, of course, to pass Karina's bill, the network's primary legislation, really seeking to address this specific breakdown around accounting for and removing somebody's firearms in a domestic violence scenario where an order of protection is in place and somebody has lost their right to possess a firearm. Our work on Karina's bill now started multiple years ago. It's been a long project for us in advocating to address this issue. And specifically, the legislation was named after Karina, following her tragic death and the death of her daughter, Daniela. We worked to introduce Karina's bill in the General Assembly to tackle the issue of urgent firearm removal as a part of the order of protection process when we know there is a heightened risk of lethality to the survivor and their children. Karina's story is a very tragic one, and it is unfortunately not unique. We've seen other survivors since the time that our legislation was first introduced who have passed due to similar circumstances where an order of protection was in place and a firearm was not appropriately removed. So what does Karina's bill do? What are we talking about here? It does a few different things, and we're going to just kind of walk through those one by one. First and foremost, Karina's bill requires firearm removal to occur during the service of an emergency order of protection when it is granted by a judge. So, if an order is issued and it says, you are not supposed to interact with this person, you are not supposed to possess firearms, the firearm removal happens when you are informed that you are not supposed to have them. It also clarifies existing language in the statute, specifically the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, um, that says that a judge can issue a warrant when granting the firearm remedy, which allows for really consistent firearm removal across the state. So it just makes sure that we're using the same tool in every county, that formally kind of grants the authority that is necessary by a judge to law enforcement to actually enact the order as it is issued. It also closes a loophole in the current statute by barring transfer of ownership of firearms when that remedy is issued. So, right now, there is this loophole where somebody subject to an order of protection knows they cannot have their firearms, and they might transfer ownership to their mom, who they live with, or to their cousin across the street. And we know that that does not meaningfully remove access to those firearms. And so we're kind of closing that loophole with this bill to ensure that when a firearm is removed, it is truly removed and that access does not continue to be an issue in that scenario. And lastly, it adds dating partners and ex-dating partners to the list of eligible petitioners on a firearm restraining order, which is a slightly different tool than our order of protection, which just creates additional avenues for firearm relief when an OP is not needed. So it kind of creates two different tools that are available to survivors, that they can use to assess their needs and their situation and make the decision that is best for them about how to safely disarm the person that is causing them harm. We obviously feel very strongly about this bill as an important part of our solution to addressing domestic gun violence in Illinois. And what I want to draw your attention to is that we are not standing alone in a crowd. We really see that Karina's bill is in line both with expert recommendations and with public support. Karina's bill is in line with policy recommendations from leaders in this space, like the Battered Women's Justice Project and the Prosecutors Against Gun Violence, many of whom have recommended common sense gun laws that ensure that when an order of protection is in place, firearm access is removed. Additionally, we see that 81% of Americans support laws that prohibit a person subject to domestic violence restraining orders from having a gun for the duration of their order. And 78.9% of Americans support laws that create temporary firearm removal mechanisms for individuals who are at risk of harming themselves or someone else. So the experts agree that common sense gun regulation, like Karina's bill, is essential to saving lives. And the people agree that these are reasonable restrictions to live in safer communities. If you can see here, a myriad of logos. We also just want to raise that our work on Karina's bill is not happening in a vacuum, is not happening alone. We have an incredible coalition of well over 40 different organizations that have endorsed Karina's bill. It passed the House in the spring of 2023 and has 23 co-sponsors in the Senate at this time. So we believe that there really is all the support that we need to move forward with Karina's bill and see it pass into law, into life-saving law. And I'm going to pass it over to Maralia to tell us a little bit more about where the bill stands right now.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Really appreciate that. I'll just add that, on the last slide, there was an array of support, and I can't emphasize that enough. We have really done this in partnership with community. We have support from not just advocates in this space and survivors, but we also have support from our partners in gun violence prevention community, as well as support from the Cook County Sheriff's Office, Tom Dart, report, and the Illinois College of Emergency Physicians, Doctors for America, who really understand as healthcare professionals this vital intersection of domestic violence and the increased risk of lethality. So I just want to thank you if you're in the room, if you're participating, for your ongoing support, for mobilizing your communities at this intersection to bring not just awareness to Karina's bill and support for Karina's bill, but also awareness and support to addressing the issue of domestic violence, because it's one that we don't talk enough about in not just our homes, but in our communities and in our larger policy and advocacy recommendations outside of the community. So thank you for being a partner in this work. And so as we look towards what that means for Karina's bill and what this large support has meant for the movement, is, as my colleague Shelby said, an earlier version of the bill passed the House of Representatives in spring of 2023. Last year, we were able to have really meaningful conversations with legislators and continue to build that off of that support. And so we're currently working on hopefully passing the bill in veto session. And veto session is a truncated period of time where legislators are back in Springfield, both the House and the Senate, to take up measures that either the governor vetoes or mandatory vetoes, but it's also an opportunity to take up legislation that there is wide support for and that can pass during this truncated period of time, which we would argue Karina's bill has that support behind it. And so we've listed out the veto session calendar dates there below, which is November 12th through the 14th and November 19th through the 21st. And we would really encourage you to get engaged in this process. So how you can support Karina's bill, obviously contact your local legislators, your state representative, your state senator, and let them know that you support this common sense piece of legislation that really is looking to strengthen our state law and enforcement and removal of firearms from domestic violence situations. And you can do this right now by either scanning the QR code and sending an email to your legislator. That is a live QR code, and it takes 2 minutes to fill out. You just put in your name, your address, and it auto-populates who your legislators are. And we have a pre-scripted email that you can send out to your legislators. And we're really doing this to mobilize community, to take advantage that we're all here in one virtual room together, to really create change, because the electeds, they represent us. And if we are unified in this ask, we know that it can happen as a community with your support. So we would just ask that you take just a moment to scan the QR code, sign up for our policy alerts, send an email to your legislator, letting them know that you want to see this life-saving measure pass in November. We would also ask that you scan this other QR code to get access to our full report, which is on our website. You can download it there at any time. And we would also encourage you to stay up to date with measuring safety. Measuring safety, as we covered earlier in the presentation, is really the brand for the reports that the network does. And so we are continuing to do the work of looking into topics and intersections of domestic violence and how we can work as a community to address all of the systems and the places at which survivors go to look for support. And so future editions of the report will focus on subject areas that vary, but we'd love to have you on our mailing list if you're interested and you're interested in continuing being a supporter of domestic violence change and advocacy. We would really encourage you to read our report and join us for future report launches. So we know that that was a lot, but it really brings us to the conclusion of our presentation. Thank you, everyone.